Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support the channel on Locals, Subscribe Star, and Buy Me a Coffee. Today is episode 23 of Political Commentary, Modeling Threats. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Glad to be here.
So today's episode is picking up where we left off last week. So after the show, Florian and I did some brainstorming. And we thought, well, hey, we came up with a rubric to grade or describe threats. Well, what we should do now is run some, for lack of a better word, simulations. Like what might a threat vector approach look like from a peer power against, say, the United States. So in preparation for this, what I did was I fed Grok the transcript of last week's episode, asking for a summary. And it gave, of course, the 4 points that I gave, right, with some fleshing out. And then I asked it to formulate some threat scenarios, 2 for China against the United States and 2 for Russia against Europe. So we're going to look into those and unpack it. So for those who maybe did not see last week, what we're first going to do is just briefly go over what Grok said as a summary of last week's show. The 4-tiered framework of influence, core theme. Tier 1, espionage, agents and subversion, most powerful and insidious. Place loyal agents or influencers inside the target country's government, institutions, or elite circles to shape policy decision in the foreign power's favor. Historical examples, Soviet spies, modern examples, Zionist influence, techniques, gradual scope creep, 1%, shifts compounding over time, demoralizing propaganda, and inward spies. Defense, shibboleths. Tier 2, owning assets and economic presence. Examples, British Petroleum in Iran, Chinese companies and property ownership in the U.S. Risks, potential for espionage, influence over local politics, and creation of sleeper networks. Proposed defense, laws limiting foreign ownership. 3, economic and diplomatic soft pressure. Examples, U.S. sanctions on Iran, Iraq, EU's Digital Services Act. Additional points, mutual dependencies, limited extreme actions. China dumping U.S. bonds would hurt itself. Tier 4, military hard power, least abstract. Direct threats of invasion, insurgencies, or fifth columns. For the U.S., this is currently the least credible threat, except limited strikes or non-state actors. Modern and analogs, Mexican cartels operating across the border, function like armed sleeper cells, and then fifth columns. All right, so let's look at the first threat scenario sketched out. This is China against the United States, and it's using all 4 examples. So scenario number 1, tech dependency, lock-in, and crisis sabotage. Focus, undermining U.S. technical edge and preparedness. Goal, prevent or delay full U.S. decoupling in critical technologies, semiconductors, EVs, batteries, rare earths, while preparing the ability to disrupt U.S. infrastructure and military logistics during a Taiwan contingency or major crisis. This creates strategic paralysis. Tier 1, use United Work Department, UFWD, networks, talent recruitment programs, e.g. 1,000 talents, and elite capture to place or influence agents, informants in U.S. tech firms, universities, Congress, and think tanks. These actors lobby against aggressive export controls, promote mutual benefit narratives, and subtly shift policy debates toward engagement over confrontation. Gradual scope creep could include influence in regulatory approvals or downplaying crisis of Chinese-linked investments. Tier 2, acquire and maintain minority but strategically placed stakes in U.S. companies via proxies, offshore entities, or joint ventures, targeting EV supply chains, LIDAR, autonomous tech, vehicle tech, ports, data centers, or semiconductor support industries. Even non-controlling stakes, e.g. 10 to 20%, in key nodes provide intelligence, board influence, and leverage over branding supply decisions while creating networks of dependent U.S. executives. Tier 3, economic diplomatic pressure, weaponized dominance in rare earth mining, gallium, germanium, and battery materials through selective export restrictions or threats thereof to coerce U.S. policymakers and corporations. Diplomatic efforts via BRICS, UN votes, or bilateral deals could isolate U.S. hardliners. While economic interdependence, generates domestic corporate lobbying against tariffs or decoupling supply chain. Choke points amplify this. And then tier 4, pre-positioned cyber capabilities, e.g. operations akin to the Volt Typhoon or Salt Typhoon, deep in U.S. critical infrastructure, power grids, telecom, logistics, and military C4ISR systems for potential disruption. In a crisis, activate denial of service or physical effect attacks to delay U.S. force projection in the Pacific. Gray zone maritime or cyber harassment could distract or test responses. Potential impact. Erodes U.S. military technical superiority over time and raises the cost of defending allies like Taiwan without direct kinetic war. All right. So we'll start with this. I thought that was a really detailed and interesting analogy of Grok weaving all of this together. It seems very plausible to me. Florian, do you have anything you want to add on this?
The funny thing is that I also did the same on ChatGPT. For whatever reason, I've landed in terms of AI usage on ChatGPT. It's not the best, but for my purposes, it seems to work. And the model is kind of similar what it got, right? So basically, what it put out was so 4 tiers, right? It calls it COVID internal steering, structural economic entanglement, like owning assets, supply chains, and so on. Then diplomatic financial pressure and overt coercion. And the COVID internal steering, tier A, has the highest leverage. Basically saying that, espionage, or you have some saboteurs and bureaucracy, stuff like that, right? And what it puts out, there's 4 different axes. There's a threat vector, so how something is done, like according to the 4 tiers. And then the target layer, so where does it go? The operational layer, how something appears, and what's the outcome of that. And when you put it, when you deconstruct it in those dimensions, then you can actually start a threat simulation on there. However, it has not done anything in terms of we're simulating what China would do in an attack or something like that. But it would actually, it suggests that any threat actor would actually try to use the steps with the highest leverage, which would still be having some actors in the bureaucracy, having the 5th column, and covert action and so on, right? So there's several simulation packs that ChatGPT generated from that model. You have like a 1% drift in bureaucracy, right? You target a procurement agency, a regulatory body, very, very covert, very high plausibility, but you inject new review steps, equity language changes, audit demands, scope creep, and so on, right? The second would be minority stake, major leverage, right? You have like a chip firm, for example, or port logistics, grid software for there's like 17 different infrastructure industries that the FBI thinks are essential. And so you could have a minority stake in that with a major leverage. You could have a supply chain choke point shock, which sort of was what China probably did during COVID, if that was planned or not. And then you have some bank or platform with cross-border exposure that would be extraterritorial regulation squeeze, something that the EU tries to do to social media platform with the Digital Services Act, right? Because whatever happens in Europe on those platforms will come in a way back to the US, right? And yeah, that's basically the different scenarios that ChatGPT came up with, similar to what you said, but we're not looking at any specific actor and how they would do it.
Right. Yeah, that seems to be a difference in your prompts. The one thing that we didn't think of was, even though for tier 2 here, even though China doesn't have controlling stakes in this particular scenario, 10 to 20% allows them to gather intelligence and influence the board, and then that's true. I mean, you don't. It's still an in, right? You're not controlling it, but you're still getting information. This one was interesting. Scenario 2, internal erosion via opioids. So goal, weaken U.S. cohesion, workforce productivity, and political will from within by exacerbating addiction, demographic pressure, and labor cost dynamics. while using these as tools for leverage and distraction. Tier 1, influence U.S. media, academia, NGOs, and policymakers through the UFWD-linked networks, diaspora organizations, or proxies to promote narratives framing strict border control or fentanyl crackdowns as racist or economically harmful. Agents or influencers could amplify open border ideologies, downplay remittance drains or crime links, and shape elite opinion to resist decoupling measures that affect cheap labor or trade. Tier 2, invest in U.S. agriculture, food processing, logistics, pharma-adjacent sectors, or business that benefit from low-wage immigration labor. Chinese-linked firms can own stakes in supply chains, handling precursors or distribution or employee networks tied to immigration flows, creating quiet economic stakes and continued openness and dependencies. Tier 3, maintain control flow of fentanyl precursors routed through Mexico while using trade policies, tariff responses, or corporate incentives to encourage U.S. business to support high immigration or labor cost suppression. Diplomatic pressures could include resisting U.S. sanctions or precursor exports, or pushing multilateral deals that tie economic access to softer U.S. stances on international issues. And Tier 4, treat the fentanyl pipeline as the hybrid chemical gray zone operation, functioning like a non-state fifth column that causes mass casualties, strains healthcare, and fuels crime, eroding public trust and productivity. Complement with cyber operations, targeting border systems or infrastructure, and indirect support for migration networks as a pressure valve. Potential impact. Accelerates internal U.S. decline, high overdose deaths, strains social services, labor market distortions, and cultural fragmentation, reduce America's ability to project power abroad or sustain long-term competition. It mirrors the transcript's discussion of immigration as a corporate-driven security threat and exploring slack. So this is what's interesting, because this actually feels like what we read in the news. I don't really feel like this is a hypothetical. I feel like scenario 2 is actually happening. What do you think, Florian? You're muted, Florian.
Can you remind me what scenario 2 was again?
Yeah, so scenario 2 is basically.
Oh, that's the entire scenario. I see.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, the interesting part of that is that there's no single salient point sticking out, right? I mean, this looks, if you look at it, is like, okay, the bureaucracy is humming along, and there's maybe some weird things happening here and there, with cyber attacks or stuff like that, and you don't really realize that something is happening, because it's basically a combination of several things that happen under the hood. I think that's the interesting part of any of those scenarios, and I think if you want to play want to play the goal in the long run, scenario 2 is probably the best. Also, because I guess if it's kind of subdued and subtle, you also have a lot of leeway to change your approach midstream, right? If you just send the military into a certain country, then you kind of focus on that, right? Japan and the United States, they were basically not going to deviate from their military strategy, like the U.S. did military buildup in the Second World War, and Japan had to somehow try to hit the U.S. To prevent the U.S. in time from ramping up their military capacity, and that didn't work. But both Japan and the U.S. were kind of like locked in to their strategy, right, in terms of military buildup, the way they were striking the long-term strategy. Scenario 2 is basically, or any of the other scenarios also, but scenario 2 is basically something you can still change midstream, right? You can tinker with some of the tiers, right? You can have more contribution tier 1, a little bit less in tier 2, or vice versa. And so it's more likely that states will use that, because often, at least in democratic societies, the guard will change, and you don't want to do something where the guard is changing midstream, right? So you need to have it flexible enough that you're not locked into something, but to have something that the next government could also continue to use.
So what's interesting as well is these two could actually be used in tandem simultaneously, right? The first strategy can be summed up as creating impediments to U.S. technological innovation. And the second one can be seen as a second opium war, where this time China's trying to subvert the United States through drugs. And so actually the two could be integrated, these two scenarios, could be integrated into a broader strategy. But what I think is interesting about feeding these prompts to Grok and then asking it to generate this is it shows how a multi-layered approach would look, how it could unfold, right? And so if you heard Florian and I last week, it might have sounded what's the word, disconnected in the sense, like, we described each point discretely, but it wasn't necessarily tied together. It was a map or a blueprint of threat vectors, but it didn't integrate it all together and okay, here's a threat package that this nation is doing. What does it look like? What are they trying to do, right? And I think this sort of use of LLM tools helped us create something that was, that could clarify to the viewer, that this is what's going on. What are some of your thoughts, Florian?
Yeah, definitely does. Having all these different tiers spelled out, that definitely clarifies it. I actually have done something. I told ChatGPT to derive a computer simulation out of that, and it gave me an HTML file in 5 minutes. While we are firing up this, ChatGPT produced a computer simulation. Let me show it to you, and maybe to everyone who watches it right now.
Yeah, sure.
My screen. Oh. Okay. Okay. Can you see that? What I'm doing right here, is this visible?
Yeah, it's
Oh, yeah. Okay. Perfect. Let's. This is an HTML file, right? So you can just click on that, and you see that?
Yep.
Okay. Cool. So here it has different tiers, and it has sub tiers, right? A1, A2, like insider influence, bureaucratic sabotage. Tier B2, supply chain dependency with choke points. Tier D1 is military threat, overt coercion. Let's choose D1, and then we target what? Let's target the information ecosystem, right? And then I can adjust here how many. Monte Carlo is the statistical simulation, so how many trials I want to have, 2,000, 3,000. So it basically simulates a number of trials. I want to make it visible. Well, military is probably very visible. Let's put it up to 0.75, and you can tinker around with this here. As I said, ChatGPT just gave me that HTML file, right? I'm blown away. This is like unbelievable. But okay, required access inside. Let's do that with less. And then defense posture would be, let's say it's counterintelligence heavy, or let's say it's balanced. That's maybe that. So this is a direct military threat, right? And then maybe we go at it with fallback capacity and so on. So now I just click on run the simulation, and I get a log detection likelihood of 66, mitigation success is 71, which probably means that a nation, according to this program, a nation can pretty well defend against that, right? So it's readiness degradation. Then means it's operational slowdown. It's not much doing, right? You can basically right away defend against that. Now try tier A1, insider influence, and we. Let's say we level it at critical infrastructure. Let's visibility, that might be very covert. We don't realize what's happening here. Maybe it's like 0.3. And then the defense is supply counterintelligence heavy. Or let's do balance again, because we had balance before. And now we run the simulation again. Aha! And now the detection and mitigation success is less likely than we had before, right? And so this is just one example of how you can also deal with this. You can basically have a program like that, and then have people tinker with that with the different tiers, and then basically make it, have different levers that you can adjust here, have a defense posture, and then see what is actually going to be successful if you want to defend against something like that, and what might not be successful. I think that was worth talking about.
No, yeah, that was interesting. I'm gonna go back and look at the scenario, the two scenarios produced for Russia v. Europe.
Okay.
I think those are also interesting. So scenario one: energy infrastructure paralysis. Focus: fracture EU sanctions, unity, and support of Ukraine. Goal: create artificial energy shortages and infrastructure disruptions to erode public and political will for Ukraine aid and sanctions, while deepening divisions between energy-dependent states and hardliners. Tier one: expand influence operations through proxies, funded populist parties, and disinformation networks. Recruit or influence elites and energy ministries, media, and think tanks to promote negotiations and blame EU warmongering for economic pain. Use gradual scope creep to shift narrative on sanctions as self-harm. Tier two: leverage remaining or proxy-controlled states and European infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and logistics firms. Maintain or rebuild covert economic footholds and order in key ports or distribution networks to gather intelligence and subtly influence pricing availability decisions. Tier three: coordinate with OPEC Plus for higher global energy prices while threatening or manipulating residual gas oil flows to vulnerable EU states. Use diplomatic channels to offer sweetheart energy deals to compliant governments while amplifying trade friction through shadow fleet sanctions evasion that directly raises EU costs. Escalate sabotage of global alternative energy infrastructure, undersea cables, pipelines, rail lines, and power grids via GRU-linked proxies, drones, or anchors on commercial vessels, combined with cyber attacks on energy SCADA systems for denial disruptions during energy peaks. Potential impact: weaken transatlantic unity, delays on reduced military aid to Ukraine, and forces some EU states into bilateral deals with Russia, eroding collective sanctions enforcements without direct conventional war. Now, again, as with earlier Chinese scenarios, I feel like many of these are a way of describing what's already happening. So that's what's interesting too, right? I didn't tell Grok to describe what's actually happening in light of my model. That wasn't the prompt I gave. I said just construct two theories, two hypothetical scenarios for Russia, Europe. And it's interesting that it comes up with something that sounds like it's describing what's going on right now, which one isn't surprising, right? Because when it searches the internet, it's going to be searching current news. But what it does show us, though, is that this gives us a very layered approach to analyzing current events, right? Even if we say, okay, yeah, Grok is trained on what's going on in current events, so it's going to have a very plausible near future scenario. It does indicate that this is a very valuable rubric for evaluating current events and maybe even making predictions about future events. Florian.
I think with thanks to AI, we have a renaissance of simulations, because simulations, they were around, right, for especially when computers came around, but they were kind of crude. You couldn't really, you could only look at one dimension and not at many. But now, with what you did with Grok and what ChatGPT gave us with the HTML code, now I'm beginning to believe that as long as you have a model that is only complex in terms of mathematical dependencies, but that is basically has some cause and effect built in, you're getting very close to the proper simulation of real world happenings. Now, some people have said if you have a large system, then it's not just about the elements of a system and their interaction. It's about ephemeral properties that are arising from that, right? Certain unforeseen developments that you couldn't imagine would happen. And I think this shows us, though, that you can basically calculate or simulate real world events if you go deep enough mathematically. So I think that is something interesting that I always grew up with the hunch that it's not all about mathematics. There's some kind of magic that's arising from a system. But since we are able to simulate what's happening in the world pretty easily with an AI that's just able to calculate deep enough, maybe it's true. Maybe there is an opportunity for using math or science to simulate world events.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to cover the last, the fourth one, or the second Russia-Europe one. Okay. Scenario 2: Eastern flank destabilization via migration and hybrid incursion. Focus: overwhelm border states and test NATO Article 5. Goal: strain Poland, the Baltics, and the Nordic states with engineered migration surges and internal chaos, while creating pretext for limited gray zone actions that probe NATO's resolve and divert resources from Ukraine. Tier 1: active networks of agents and influencers within pro-Russian diaspora communities, far-right left parties, and NGOs to amplify anti-immigration sentiment or sow discord. Use disinformation to portray border enforcement as human rights abuses, or conversely lax policies as elite betrayal, polarizing electorates, and undermining governments. Tier 2: exploit to acquire stakes in logistics, transportation, or media companies near borders to facilitate movement or shape local narratives. Maintain economic ties in agriculture or industry that benefit from cheap migrant labor, creating internal stakeholders resistant to crackdowns. Tier 3: apply diplomatic pressure from UN or OSCE channels to criticize EU border policies while offering economic incentives to cooperative actors. Threaten secondary sanctions or trade disruptions on frontline states to deter unified responses. Tier 4: weaponize migration by routing flows through Belarus as human ammunition, overwhelming reception systems compliant with sabotage, and political unmarked incursions, using proxies or little green men tactics backed by cyber attacks on a broader infrastructure scale. Potential impact triggers political polarization across Europe, strain Schengen and asylum systems, boost populist parties critical of NATO EU, and raises the risk of miscalculation on the eastern flank, potentially delaying or complicating collective defense, while Russia consolidates gains elsewhere. Now, as the program said, it specifically incorporated my critique of immigration as a weapon. And, by overloading the system, that's a kind of like Cloud and Piven strategy, which Russia does know. They've been doing that on the borders with Poland, for example. But the thing that keeps surprising me about these analysis, something that I didn't think of, was both with, I think it was the second Chinese one and then the second Russian one, by supporting certain economic interest groups, specifically those that are reliant on immigrant labor. They kind of create a pressure group that puts pressure in the direction that they want to, right? It's not so much that these groups are controlled by Russia or China. It's that they have a set of incentives that aligns with the kind of pressure that Russia or China would want to put on U.S. and Russia, or U.S. and Europe, along these lines. See, I didn't think of that in the conversation, so it was interesting to see how the algorithm put that together. And it's just typical carrot and stick stuff. But I think ultimately these four scenarios that Grok constructed using the framework that I gave sort of shows us what can be done with these sort of modeling tools, these LLMs, right? I mean, you and I, Florian, could not have done this by ourselves, 2 years ago before these things were online. Just would have been impossible. And then furthermore, the problem is the people that would have had complex modeling software were in the academy or in the government or in business. And so they had constrained concerns that, whether it's ranging from things like just being blind to the obvious to, I don't have time for this because I have deadlines to meet and objectives to accomplish, or groupthink. They didn't do it. Right. But as you said, Florian, this now gives us the ability to have many people all over the country and the world do this. So what I predict the ratchet effect is going to be is we're going to have a shift in what gets simulated and what gets talked about. And that'll help break through a lot of the control that business and the academy and the government have. Florian.
Yeah, I would add another vector that we haven't thought about so far, which is time, right? So basically, you're not deploying all four tiers at the same time. For example, I may start with tier two, right? If I'm China, I start acquiring some land innocuously, right, inside the U.S., and then I use those properties holdings to get some spies in, right? Some people into the local. If you have local property somewhere, you can get into the local business community, right? And then you get into more advanced positions where you can then covertly influence the system from within. You probably need to first acquire property before you can send people in. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit too suspicious, maybe, or maybe not. But you know, time is certainly something that we need to take into account. And also, like the military action, maybe in the end, you just use the military to maybe your enemy has already broken down. You just use the military to take out the last rubble or something like that, right? So that time is an arrow that we need to also somehow put in there. And I think also you need to keep into mind that some actions aren't taking always with a cover with an you not every country does things that they do because they want to destroy the other country, right? It may start as some way to get economically better, right? Maybe just some harmless competition, and then later on somebody discovers that there's a vulnerability in your opponent's defenses, and you can exploit that and actually really get a piece of the action from your opponent, right? So that we'd also have to take that into account, I think. And then there's also more complex second order effects, or I don't know how you call it, but for example, Germany, we have these LLMs now. We can do a lot of great things with it, and everyone in the world can do that. But if you look at Germany, how Germany develops electronic and software, they do it for engineers. So Germany is notorious for not developing things for the broad masses. They develop something for the engineers at the academy. It's basically innovation in Germany is from academy to academy often. And when you have that, then certain things are not even, certain things that a country may develop, they are not really usable immediately to influence public opinion or something like that, right? That also needs to be taken into account. And number three, it's not just that everyone in the world has access to AI tools. The government also now has. And I have read this recent article was yesterday on X, by someone saying that basically we have like 1 or 2 years at max, and then there's going to be no significant software developers around because everything is done by Grok and AI, and that ChatGPT, Claude, and so on, right? So then building a program or anything like that will become a commodity. But that also means that governments will now take a lot of will use these programs as well, right? And they have war games at the Pentagon. I bet you they're now using AI, Grok, and other programs for those war games as well, right? So it's going to be very interesting. We may have a simulation like the one I just showed, and it shows interesting things, and we can tinker with it and say, oh, that's interesting. If we focus more on defending against supply chain choke points, then the likelihood of them succeeding becomes very low. But every government now has the same ability, and they're probably developing deeper simulations. So I believe there's also going to be an AI. It's also going to be a, how do you call it, a tug of war, or when one
Arms race.
nation.
Arms
Arms
race.
race, exactly. It's going to be AI arms race within government. And I tell ChatGPT, take the transcript from last week's YouTube and program a simulation from it. Takes the thing 5 minutes to do it. So what will a government do that has days to do it, right? It will be incredibly deep simulations, and that's also something that is both exhilarating and also a little bit frightening.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions from the chat that I think are directly relevant to what we've just discussed. RYS Young, he has a couple questions I want to get into. The first one is, I wonder if this will lead to more surprise actions and attacks. Um, it could. It could, in the sense that if you can run all these models and get, probabilities attached to all the outcomes, it might come into the view of the nation that wishes to do this, that it's worth their time. What will be interesting to see is if these models come up with strategies that the humans who fed it the data didn't actually come up with. Right? It's like, we're just going to give you this prompt and start running some simulations. In fact, what might happen is it might simulate a threat that the other nation is actually planning, but nobody in the recipient nation knows about. And the only reason why the LLM does this is because it's just running through every single option. And if you have like a prompt engineer who just looks for like something new, he's like, oh, hey, that's new over there. Let's see what's over there. That would be interesting. I'm not saying that has happened, but I think it could. Another one is it extrapolating based on news, or is it interpolating between white papers? I'm assuming that Grok is just interpolating from the news. I don't think what we have or what's commercially available has access to government white papers. Though I suppose you could train it on that if you wanted. Probe
Yeah,
the
I mean,
model.
white papers are white papers accessible to the public or not?
I think some are. I don't know if all of them are. And then also Ryan, he says, probe the model more and elaborate from it. Well, exactly. This is what we call a proof of concept. So those are, I think, were all very interesting questions. And when I asked Grok this yesterday, there's those little bubbles that pop up as it's searching through the internet, and most of them were publicly accessible websites. It wasn't like it was, stuff that's behind a paywall or a subscription wall or anything like that. But it is interesting. The other thing too, though, you mentioned the arms race that might develop for LLMs who are modeling these strategies. But of course, we have to remember that the LLM is only as good as the prompt engineer that gives it the prompt. And I think that even though China is making strides in a lot of different fields, and the United States, of course, is still struggling with the legacy of the woke and the legacy of punishing and repressing the intelligent, competent men in its communities. See, the East works more as a mass, so it creates this mass and just hurls it at you. And because of its size, whether it's Russia or China, and it's effective once you organize it, once you actually have it together. But you have to build it, and that takes time, and that's whatever. But of course, China being a communist country, growing up, my thoughts were, they're just going to have, political correctness with the commissars, right? The thing is that we have that too now in the United States. So it's like the playing field has been artificially leveled because the United States has artificially reduced its potential to do these things. In gaming terms, it nerfed itself. But if the United States can overcome this, and then by extension Europe, I think Western man will be a better prompt engineer. I think he would come up with better prompts to feed the system if he was allowed to. Now, of course, that's not happening yet, and I'm concerned it might take defeats on the battlefield before that actually happens.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Well, yeah, because the point is, the people who put this in place, okay, they still think it's working because it's working for them. And what's the only thing at this point that's going to get through to them that they have the wrong people in the positions beneath them? Well, a catastrophic defeat somewhere would be the only thing I could think of. And even then, it might not be enough because the United States is oblivious to its loss in Vietnam and Afghanistan. So it's not even guaranteed. But go ahead, Florian.
Yeah, that's a good. It's very interesting how like all too human problems are bleeding into this, right? We're not willing to accept defeat. Yeah, okay, that matters, right? If we accept, look, we got our ass kicked in Vietnam. If you put that into the model versus we kind of still won in Vietnam, that model will give out something different, right? I think we do have the opportunity though to test the models. We can basically take all the military models and basically give the models the input that, like, give the model all the armies that Napoleon had at Austerlitz. Let's say, see whether it still comes out to, will still whether it will still predict Napoleon's win. And if it doesn't, you can correct it, right? Then you take the battles in the Crimean Wars, the Battle of First World War, Battle of Second World War, and Vietnam as well. And if you do that, then you should come to a model that is pretty. I mean, if you have a model that reliably predicts every other battle in the past, if that's possible, I would trust the model also for the future. But here's the thing that that Asian nation will not be able to do so easily, and we will not be able to do it easily with Asian nation. The human element, like what we feel, what all these things mean to us, we are not just like data. We have a certain narrative has developed about it, which can be detrimental to our own purpose, right? Like if the narrative is we didn't get our ass kicked in Vietnam, then if you put that into a model, then it gives faulty results out. But there's still something human that we have that an AI model doesn't have, and that will show in prompts that we put in. But it will also, there's some additional strategic thinking that we can probably infuse into the process. Like if you take World War II, Hitler did the Blitzkrieg strategy against 80 to 90% of his generals, right? And he just kind of did that on a hunch. But on the other hand, it was also important to do something new, right? So the majority of Hitler's generals wanted to do World War II like they did in World War I, right? Hoping this time they would win. And Hitler said, no, we need to use our Luftwaffe to bombard the fortifications behind the front. And so that's the Blitzkrieg strategy, right? That's probably now not working anymore, such a strategy. So we have different strategies, right? But I think throughout history, whoever could use novel things on the battlefield that their opponent hasn't seen before will usually win the war. And I think this novelty element is something that may be decisive. We talked about AI in warfare already in the past. Like we talked about that in the Ukraine war, right? We said, okay, we have all the AI now that should make winning a war much easier. But then it turns out when both sides have AI tools, then what you get in the end is a war for attrition, right? Exactly like that. Exactly what we said before. If both governments have access to these simulations, chances are, if you use simulation, you will just butt heads like that, right? But then you come up with something new that the model didn't think about because your opponent didn't think about, and then you can actually win the war because it's a completely novel element. How that will look like with AI around, because it seems really that AI has everything covered, but I'm still holding out hope that there will be some new things that AI doesn't know that humans will know, right?
Yeah. So let's again go to the bottleneck here. It's the prompt engineer that feeds the algorithm, that trains the algorithm, but then also then feeds it the prompts to run. And again, if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution, which is neutering heavily, American and European men from getting into these positions to be creative again, I think the West would have the advantage. Currently, I don't think they do because of political decisions that they've made, and so that now plays to the strengths of the East. And with these LLM tools that are being used, it's like they can do it too. But we need to remember one: low-tech insurgents can still win. Because the Bush administration said, we create our own reality. Turns out you don't. Turns out the Taliban is still in Kabul. No, duh. And the other thing is, I'm going to go to my high horse again about why it can't happen. Qualia. There's a thing about having this human perspective that a computer can never have. So if you're, a special forces operator or a general, you have a certain gut feeling, an instinct that just no computer is going to have. A perfect example is MacArthur in Korea. He had this instinct that if he could land at Incheon, he could cut off the North Korean army, trap it in the south, and then otherwise the Pusan pocket breakout would have been a very long and bloody affair marching north. Whereas by severing their supply lines, MacArthur was then able to just, do a complete Hail Mary and just take them out. And they got as far as the Yalu afterwards before the Chinese intervention. And LLM wouldn't have predicted that. Partly because the prompt engineer wouldn't have told it to do that, because you have to have that indescribable genius that MacArthur had. Because even the Joint Chiefs of Staff said it was impossible. They said, oh, you can't do Inchon. He did. So, that is something that you could sort of, the best you could do is you could create a variable. It's called X, because that's what, Clausewitz's X factor, right? We'll call it X. And you just try to manage for that. Or that's the best you can do. And that, that works, but it doesn't get you to like a paradigm shift. You still need the human element. And that's where in the long run, I think the West has the advantage if and when it decides to allow its creative intellectuals to start working again. Florian.
Yeah, if it lets creatives work again, and I have little hope that that will happen in the EU. They just seem hell bent on just like choking off all innovation by just starting with the Digital Service Act that blocks off social media. I'm reminded of a book I read about an insurgency where American gun owners get together underground and they fight against the government and are successful because the government is super politically correct and they don't see the threat that's developing under their nose, basically, because you can't be racist, that can't be, and they just like close the ears to that. So I would think that maybe, like, for example, China, they are more robust in terms of racism, for example. They could post blatant racist stuff on social media, that they could do that to sabotage social media altogether in the US. Or they could do that to basically then use alternative platforms to then spread their own propaganda, their sabotage effects and everything, right? But you could basically destroy a bureaucratically heavy country by being extremely against the rules, so that they will basically ban the platform that you attack, and they don't realize that, right? So that's also a way that you could basically take advantage of your enemy, and the enemy will not be able to simulate that because we all sit in sort of like an aquarium, right? And if we hem ourselves in and don't allow our creativity to flourish, then there will be ways for enemies to exploit that and to shut us down, basically, right? And we won't even realize that because the fish doesn't realize it's living in the aquarium. A fish doesn't realize when you put, like, if you have a sweetwater aquarium, a freshwater aquarium, and you pour salt into it every day a little bit more until the fish are all dead. You wouldn't realize that, and I think that's also one of the problems that Western nations that are going politically correct have. They will face the problem, right? And they will not see the problem because all their infrastructure is geared towards enhancing their bureaucracy and shutting off what is not allowed. And that would be one example how an opponent could have a surprise attack that nobody realizes can happen.
Yeah. So I think to wrap this up, I'll just summarize what I think LLMs can do for us with this particular question of creating these sort of like threat packages of describing the different ways one nation could threaten another. It's a force multiplier. So what's really happening here is it's basically a free research assistant that works at the speed of light, which is pretty nice. That's pretty cool, right? It's a free research assistant. And of course, you get better features if you pay more. Okay, whatever. But it's a research assistant that works at the speed of light. And so then what you can do, but it's within a narrow domain. We have to remember there's a domain here in which it works. And that domain is after you fed it. First of all, it's after you fed it the prompts. And then it's operating within what it's been trained on. Now, so this means that in a time in which, say, conflict is not rapidly changing, it's very effective because there aren't a lot of unexpected variables popping up. But if you were to have a rapidly changing threat environment, especially if the prompt engineers can't move fast enough, then you might start to have some problems because it needs to be aware that all this is changing, and it needs to take in that new data and do something about it. It's not going to do it itself. And then second of all, when it comes to statistical formulations and doing data research, You have to have enough data points to do it. But in a rapidly changing environment, so I'll give you an example. When the first modern war, World War I, when you had airplanes and tanks and submarines and battleships, all that stuff, people had a general idea of how they might be used, but it was like very intuitional, right? Like the fighter pilots in the Great War were very much intuition based. It didn't become a science until the end. Now, if you were to have a computer program, an LLM today, go back and quantify all the features of like a World War I weapon system, it could do it. But that's because we have all the data now, right? We had the war, we had battlefield reports, we had the engineers writing about these weapon systems. Okay, but in a rapid, if you go from like the Boer War to World War I and this rapid, massive change, LLMs would have a hard time keeping up, I think, because there isn't enough stuff to feed them yet, right? Things are changing so fast. So that's the main limitation. Final thoughts, Florian.
I have a slightly more optimistic take, actually. So if you realize that, on LLMs are just a tool, right? Like anything else, like the computer, like the printing press, like the feather keel, whatever, with which you could write down your thoughts and so on. And now it's so far that maybe in 5, 6, 7 years, the LLMs will be able to do things that we didn't realize we needed yet. So basically, I think we'll come to a point where you have an AI running on your machine, looking at all the emails and files you receive, files you send out, stuff like that, email, web pages you visit, and so on. You just need to tell the AI in the end, get it done, and it will do everything that you wanted to do over the day, because it knows exactly what needs to be done and what you want to do. So isn't it possible that AI will recommend certain government actions that will be so advanced that we don't realize what we are doing, and then AI will lead to a balanced, peaceful world, because everyone subtly will put in measures that guarantee a balance of power. So basically, I envision a future where an AI, let's call it Bismarck 2.0, will start to implement diplomatic relations between different nations that are now so intricately aligned that a hostile confrontation is next to impossible, right? Still, Bismarck got upended by the imperialism of the European nation and some less than wise action by William II and other emperors at that time. But still, wouldn't it? I have an optimistic view that maybe AI will allow us to have a very stable, peaceful world.
Well, on that white pilling note, thank you, Florian. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off. Bye-bye.